Welcome to Home Education Matters, the weekly podcast supporting you on your home education journey. Hello and welcome to another episode of Home Education Matters, and today I'm joined by Dr Karem Roitman from Thinkers Meetup, and today we are talking about incorporating politics and philosophy into your home education journey. And I'm going to slightly change the start of this podcast because normally at this point, people who listen to my podcast will know that I go and say hello to the guest and I ask them to tell us a little bit about themselves. But I'm not going to do that this time, not quite yet, because I would like to read you something from the Thinkers Meetup website about Karem. Because we have had a lot of very cool guests on this podcast. I've been very, very fortunate to have some very exciting guests on the podcast. But I think I may have maxed myself out this time because let me read you Karem's biography. Karem has a doctor's of philosophy, a master's of philosophy, both from Oxford University. She has a Bachelor of Arts in Economics. She has a Bachelor of Science in Political Science. She has lectured at Oxford University, Regent's University, and the Open University. And just in her spare time, she also has served as a consultant for none other than the United Nations. Karem, you're slacking. This is, my God, I mean, you need to fill your time more, woman.
You're making me blush.
That's quite a CV. I mean, that's pretty impressive. But actually, do you know, my favourite bit of that biography was when you said, however, the best training for teaching has come from home educating my sons, you said. Now, that's pretty fabulous after that CV, that home education for you has been the best sort of training tool for teaching. So anyway, now I've bigged you up, and you bigged yourself up there. Thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today. It's really lovely to have you with us. And do tell us a little bit about yourself that wasn't figured in that very stellar CV.
Well, I stand by what I said. I have had the pleasure and the privilege of having a really good education, which has come through a lot of sacrifice on my parents' parts. And, I come from a history of migrants and refugees. So they have put in so much effort to try to get me where I've gotten. So I'm here not because of what I've done, but because of the people that have suffered and worked behind me did, right? So it's all thanks to them. But having said all of that, when I went to school and then I started teaching at university and I started tutoring, I had some training to tutor. But when I started teaching in university, they just kind of plugged you in there. And I taught for several years before I became a mother. And then I decided to home educate my children because of what they needed. And at that point, it made me rethink everything. When you teach other people in a way that you're removed from them, in a way that you cannot be removed from your children, you start to rethink education. Because I wasn't seeing my kids as my students. I was seeing my kids as the humans that they were and who I wanted them to be. So it made me go back to philosophy to think about what education should be, what the human is, what the person is, what they need. And as I did that, it made me reflect on the way that I had been teaching and all the things that I did wrong and all the people I wish I could find and apologize, honestly. And just, it made me realize, it made me find joy in education as well in a way that I wasn't, right? Because when you're an academic, you're so high up there in ideas that you sometimes forget the joy of exploration and the foundation of joy that you have to lay at the beginning of finding a new topic, right? So going back to toddlerhood and seeing kids find, a squirrel for the first time and naming it and chasing it, or seeing snails or, dewdrops or wind, every little thing was just a joy of discovery. And then you realize this is what it should always be like, this fun, we can bring it into everything. So it just made me rethink how I did everything and how I approached, everything from teaching my children all the way to my university students. I still do it differently now. And I see them. What has transformed me as well is now I see each of my students, even though some of my students are mature students, as they're called, right? So they've had a full career. They've come back to university. I still now see them as somebody's child, which I didn't before. And I know that every word I say matters to them. And I think about how their parents would feel. And so I try to build them up as humans. And I see education as again, when I started teaching, education was about the exams. We have to get this knowledge in, we have to get these things done. But I don't see that for my kids. I see it as a long-term process for them to become healthy, kind human beings who have the skills to learn things that I can't teach them, that I haven't even thought about teaching them. And I see the same for my students. So it's not about what we do now. It's about giving you the tools you need to continue to learn and the joy that you need to want to continue to learn. So it's completely transformed everything I do. And I'm very grateful for that. It's been hard, right? It's not easy for all of this wonderful parents who are out there doing this. It's not like you wake up every day and you're Mary Poppins. You're not. I am Cruella de Vil sometimes, but we try.
I feel like you've summed up home education like perfectly in about 5 sentences there. I mean, you're right. It's so much about equipping them with tools and also just allowing that natural joy of learning that I remember very distinctly when my children were quite young. We were living in Crete, and I think my daughter was about 3, my son was about 5, and I looked out into the olive grove, and my son had a leaf, and they were really close up. They were looking at this leaf, and my son was like pointing to the veins of the leaf, and my daughter was kind of looking at it and nodding, and he was obviously explaining something about the leaf structure to her. And I thought, this is how children learn. You don't need to interject yourself in any way. You can just kind of let them do it. And it's very beautiful. And I think nature is normally one of the first routes into learning that children discover. So when we're thinking about incorporating politics and philosophy into home education, one of the reasons I wanted to talk about this is because there is no exam for politics or philosophy at GCSE level. And I think there used to be a politics, but then they scrapped it. And the closest we have now is citizenship and global citizenship, actually, which I've done a podcast on. But for me, the subjects of politics and philosophy, if there had been GCSEs in those, we would for sure have sat GCSEs in those, both of my children, because even though both my children are very, very different, one is very sciencey, one is very humanities based, they both love those subjects. They have a natural interest in both of those subjects. And I feel like children have a natural affinity to those subjects. And I don't know if it's just mine, but I feel like home educated children in particular, when they're allowed that freedom, they find themselves naturally exploring those subjects. So I wanted to bring Karem in to talk about, okay, so maybe there's no GCSE in these subjects, but what can we do to incorporate politics and philosophy into our home education life? So first of all, I'm going to vaguely try to structure this episode so it doesn't go too bonkers, because I'm super tempted with this subject to really go for it. We're going to stick to the kind of question, the big questions like why, when, how, all of those. And the first one I think is why. So why do you think, and I'm assuming you agree with me because I know you teach this at Thinkers Meetup, so why do you think that these subjects of politics and philosophy in particular are really important to incorporate into home education?
Right. So I've mentioned this to you, but it's been on my mind because I have recently finished a book, right? Which it's about philosophy, political philosophy specifically for the bright and curious, I think they're calling the book. So it's for young teens. And when I approached the publisher and I said, we need to do this, I had the why. And the why is because these are the questions that we all ask as children. We all ask as humans, but eventually we don't have a space to enter into that conversation. Maybe our parents are too busy. Maybe there's no one around us that takes us seriously. But this is innate in our, Aristotle said humans are naturally political animals. We're sum politikon, right? So we start playing. You mentioned your kids playing together, and I'm sure at some point, one of them took away the leaf or something, and the other one said, "That's not fair." It's like, well, I'm bigger than you. What are you going to do? And so we start, as soon as we have any interaction, we start thinking about, is this fair? Is this just? Does the bigger one get to decide? Why is my mom always listening to the little one? All these questions of fairness and justice and distribution and power. This is what humans do. This is how we form society. And we see it in the house, we see it in the playground, we see it wherever we go, right? We go to the shop and someone's rude to us and you think, how should I behave? Everywhere you go. So this is part of our human nature. Now, like any part of our experience, if we don't have a language to discuss it in, then it can turn into frustration. So part of the reason why I think we need to engage in these conversations is because we're expanding our vocabulary as humans. We're giving ourselves a way to discuss it, to understand how we feel, what we want, and to advocate for ourselves, right? We want our children to say, this is how I feel, this is what feels right to me, this is why I think this. And if we provide that education, then they have the ability to verbalize that, to consider it, to reason about it, to understand their feelings. So it's about, again, going back to their whole humanity, their need to understand themselves, their need to interact with others, and their need to consider why people act in the way they do and what they think would be better, both at the very private level within the home and at the global level, right? Because as we grow, we expand that awareness of where we fit. And it's not just me and my mommy and my daddy, it's me and, this community, and then it's me and my country, me and the world. And as they expand that, again, we need to expand with them that understanding of where they fit in, how they fit in, what they want to change. It's not just about understanding it as this is the way it is, right? But this is, what do you want it to be? So again, here are the tools. How do you want to change this world? And we need to understand how it works so you can go out there and transform it. You don't have to be happy with it. You don't have to let it be, right? You just need to go out and make it be what you want it to be. So that's why I think we need to teach it. Kids are interested, kids want to know, and kids need to know. And in my classes, I see this, right? Because a lot of the kids, sometimes most of the time they come because they want to, but sometimes they're signed up by their parents. And they're like, what is this? But when you start having just chats, which is what we do, and conversations and saying, what do you think about this? And, you know, it's just fun. Humans just want to sit around and have these conversations, which is why I love political philosophy, right? To me, it's my biggest hobby. Because then we want to sit around and say, well, what should we do? And new things are coming up all the time with AI now. What should we give? Are we going to limit AI? Are we ever going to give rights to AI? There's all these things happening in education. Is it ethical for me, instead of writing a letter to a person, to have the machine do it and then sign it? So you think that these emotions that the machine has expressed came from me, and you attribute those to me? So many interesting questions. And again, and you just change the tone a little bit depending on the age of the kids, right? You change the topic or the depth you go into, but it's just fun at every age. I'll stop because I could just keep going. It's fun.
So for you, it's not just empowering at a personal level by giving them the language and the ability to talk about what they need and what their rights are, but also it empowers, I'm guessing, them generationally, so it's empowerment of a whole generation to collectively be able to talk about these things and to talk about their values and to talk about their rights.
Absolutely. One of the things that we want to do at Thinkers Meetup, which is still something that we haven't developed enough yet, is also is exactly, we've mentioned briefly in previous conversations that education is political, right? And so when we give students the ability to speak in a way that will be heard, it's not that it's the only way to speak or the right way to speak, but we have to realize that we work within structures of power and institutions that are structured and set up in specific ways. So if we give our students the ability to understand and speak to those institutions, the ability to speak up to power, then we're giving them that power to bring the voice of their community, of their family, out to where they want it to be heard, right? We're just amplifying those ideas they have. It's never about teaching kids what to think. It's always about helping them process their own thinking and sharpen it.
So would you say that philosophy, or the incorporation of philosophy into home education journey, would it that have a similar reason behind it to empower, or would you say that philosophy as a subject there's a different motivation for bringing that into home education?
I wouldn't. I think I don't separate philosophy and politics, in part because my background is a political philosopher, so I've always combined the two. And I don't understand politics without philosophy. But I also don't understand philosophy without structures of power, right? Anything that philosophy looks at, from how the world is set up to the structure of language, all of that is inherently embedded in power, and that's where politics comes in. So I think they're both the same. In looking at curriculums, a lot of philosophy, the way that it has been taught to young kids, tends to be merged in with religion, and it which is a part of discussing, reality, but it's not all of it. And that's, I think, why a lot of the kids who have been hesitant at first to take my classes, for example, they assume we're going to be talking about same trite discussion that a lot of the syllabus tends to pick up. Um, or, there's they just limit even the A-level syllabus in philosophy. And I have been trying to push different boards to expand their offerings because they tend to just be very narrowed. And this is the wonderful thing about home education, right? You don't have to submit just to that curriculum. I think there's just so much. Philosophy and politics are so exciting, and you can look at them from so many perspectives. But yes, so the motivation for the teaching of both is the same.
Is there something about the reflective nature of those particular subjects where it's less about learning facts or memorizing data or even interpreting data? They're quite unique, aren't they? They're unique subjects in as much as history, and geography, environmental management, classical civilization. You're talking about knowing certain knowing certain things and being able to interpret sources and being able to use your knowledge. And then you've got the sciences and the maths, which are a little bit more factual and having an understanding about how something might work, an equation or like a process. Whereas philosophy and politics feel almost as if you're asking questions that don't have an answer. Is there something that's inherently valuable about that?
Depends on how you teach it. Looking at the politics curriculum, there's a lot of history in it, and there's a lot of information that you need to know. So it's not entirely reflective. There's no philosophy curriculum, of course, at the GCSE. At the A level, there's a lot of information to know, but not in the historical depth of knowledge that you need for politics. But yes, I think one of the tools that, if you teach philosophy and politics reflectively, as you've mentioned, this is one of the most powerful things we teach our young people, which is to come up with your own answer when there is none. And this is something that I'm teaching my university students, and they struggle so much because their educational system has always been, this is what you need to know, go ahead and spit it. And it's that regurgitation, the banking system. And then you get to a philosophy class, and there's no right or wrong answer. You just have to tell me what you think and why. And they're like, but what should I think? It's like, I don't know what you should think. And then they tell me what they think and they don't tell me why. And it's like, but you need to provide your evidence. So if we get used from the beginning, and I think one of the wonderful things that all of the home educated kids I have met do this, right? Because they're listened to a lot. And so they argue their case. And I think that's human nature. We argue our case. But we can lose that ability in education if we're not allowed to continue to speak up about what we think and why, right? If we think just explain what others have said, because that's what we need for the exam. So I think that to be able to process an argument, sustain an argument, to provide evidence, that it forces you to be able to research, to evaluate, to analyze, to synthesize. All of this higher order thinking skills are all there. That communication skills, the ability to structure, the planning. There's so much that's happening when sometimes people sit into my classes and they're like, but you're just having a conversation with the kids. I'm like, yes, But if you listen to them when they're arguing, and when I go back and pick on the little bits, just very gentle and be like, but what about this? And they have to go back to their whole argument and see where that creates flaws. And they say, oh, well, I guess we changed this. And you don't see that. But in their brain, there's this incredible amount of learning happening because they're going back and thinking about assumptions and counter arguments and thinking about two steps forward where they're going to be. But it happens so gently in a conversation that people think, well, it's just a conversation. What learning is happening there? It's like, if you only knew.
When I did philosophy at university, most of my friends and housemates were doing a science or an engineering course, and they found it hilarious, my philosophy, because they would just be like, "That's not like, how is that an assignment?" And like, what, you're just sitting there, you're not even doing anything, and I think people do struggle because it is part of the beauty, I suppose, of it not being an exam subject is that you don't have to jump through that kind of have to quantify your learning in order to answer the question properly. So by the very nature that it isn't a GCSE and that option isn't there, it allows it to be much more, as you say, this kind of explorative learning.
Yes, if they made it into GCSE, yeah, we won't even go there. I mean, I think there's reasons to do it, but you know, then I think we also need to rethink the assessment model. There's ways to create, if we did it, but we did it in a portfolio assessment, which is what I've always advocated, right? So you explore a topic, you discuss your reasons, you show your learning and how you're applying philosophy, then it could be so exciting, but it's really hard to sell
Yeah.
it.
And again, I'm going to, and like my regular listeners will know that this is something I mention quite often, is that because I'm always desperately hoping that somebody from the exam board will be hearing me at some point and they would take, but I really wish we would move to an interview basis for assessment, because my dyslexic daughter, there is nothing she does not know about history. And yet when it comes to writing an essay, even on a word processor, if you get 3 or 4 sentences, you're lucky. But if you were to sit down with her and talk about the Second World War, she could talk you under the table. And it really frustrates me because I know it would be a little time consuming and a little bit more expensive, but actually realistically, I've examined for GCSE religious studies, and it was a very soul destroying experience because I wasn't even home educating at that point. And I just thought, shouldn't be how we do it. I just used to scan for keywords and then
Yeah.
tick them off. And I thought this is nonsense. And then I thought if we could just interview children, just literally talk to them for like 20 minutes on history, that would cover a 3-hour exam, because children really, you could know pretty quickly if what grade they were working at. But I won't go on because honestly,
But
it's like my pet hate the
but
assessment.
I agree with you, and we've had so many brilliant students at TMU at Thinkers Meetup who are just phenomenal, right? But they don't test well. But it's not that they lack the knowledge, because we keep the group so small. So I know these kids, I know what they know. But it's just, maybe it's anxiety, maybe it's dyslexia, it's dysgraphia, maybe it's just that, they're not feeling like they can present who they are on paper. And education shouldn't be about what you can transmit on paper. Surely there's more to what you've learned than that, right? I mean, it's great that some people can do it. I love writing. I'm a writer. I love it. Yet to me, it's so easy. My kids are not writers, right? This was one of the things that I learned through education. It's like, how can you not be a writer? You're my child. They're just not. They're different, right? I can't make them I want them to be. They are who they are. And education needs to embrace that and acknowledge that difference and bring it in, because it brings new things that if we were all the same, we wouldn't have.
Yeah, I mean, maybe we could incorporate AI into being some sort of interviewer of children, and then that would be really cheap. We wouldn't even have to employ people. There we are. Now that's something for you to discuss on one of your Thinkers Meetup classes. Should we use AI to assess children? Can you imagine? But anyway, we will move on to the next question word, which is when, because I wanted to ask you, do you think that there is I know that when it comes to, I think it's the Charlotte Mason approach and possibly the Montessori approach, I think definitely the Steiner approach, they have this idea that the brain isn't formed kind of to understand some abstract concepts or something like that until a certain age. Would you say that there is like an age that is primed to start this, or would you be going, as young as you want to when it comes to politics and philosophy?
Um, okay. So I think it varies tremendously by children, but in my experience, we've had really rich, wonderful conversations about quite abstract topics with very young kids. So I was just teaching a group of very young kids the other day, and we're talking about what it would be like to be an animal, right? Which we, I mean,
Oh, there's that wonderful book by Nagel, what it's like to be a bat or something,
exactly,
right?
the
Ah,
famous paper.
fabulous.
So
Mm.
it's based on that. But of course, I didn't introduce the paper to them, right? Because it's like, this is what I, no, we just start talking about, what would it be like to be an animal? And again, there's big ideas there. There's like, sense perception, blah, blah. We don't need any of that. We can just talk about what it would feel like. Do you think it's possible? We get into the body, we embody it, we pretend to be slugs. But we also think about, well, why couldn't we know? Could we like wire our brain differently? And kids get into it because it's really interesting and it's a very abstract topic. It's just about how we present the abstract topic. So I think a lot of the I have a big problem with a lot of the writing that I've seen in philosophy for kids. It's dumbed down. It assumes that kids cannot enter into these conversations. I think the problem is not the kids. The problems are the teachers. If you're not creative enough to bring it to the table in a way that's engaging to the kids, then you need to go out and rethink it. It's not that the kids can't do it, is that you're not doing it right. Same with politics. However, with politics, of course, again, there's a level of complexity we don't need to enter into. If we talk about the UK, we talk with the kids, we talk about the king, the monarchy, we might think about, is it right, is it not? But we're not going to enter into very specific debates of the law. The other thing with both, I guess, is that they both could take a dark turn, right? There's difficult topics in both areas. Um, and I do think that there's a sense of guarding young kids' hearts, right? And talking about things in a way they're ready when they're ready. Um, for example, animal rights is a big one, right? A lot of kids want to talk about animal rights, but they get very sensitive very quickly when they imagine their pets being hurt in any way. So it's a fine line to thread. To
Do you have different ages in your classes because of that? Do you have for ethics conversations or politics conversations, do you differentiate by age?
Oh yeah, definitely. Also because I get goofier when with younger kids, right? And if I'm as goofy as I am with younger kids, with older kids, they just roll their eyes. I'm
I
still
get
goofy.
weirdly, I get goofier when they're older. I don't know what that is. I think it's just because I know it slightly winds them up.
No, I mean I'm always goofy, but it's experiments or the thought experiments would be slightly different. I do separate, and I've had and we have a lot of gifted kids in Thinkers Meetup, but even if you're very, very bright, I think older kids would like to talk about things that they might feel less comfortable with younger kids, and we want to make a separate space. So we do separate both by and we talk with the parents because again, kids are so different. So it's their social maturity. So some kids become socially mature younger. It's just the way that they are. Um, but again, we can talk about difficult topics in a way that's still kind. So there's no reason to, involve details that are unnecessary. Even with an adult, you wouldn't want to have that conversation. So there's no reason to bring that into the kids. And that's what we do.
Well, it sounds to me like we're sort of bringing in my next question, which is how to go about not I don't really want to say teaching it, but how to go about incorporating these kind of subjects into home education. And for you, then there has to be an element of being a little wary and being a little sensitive to the child and maybe not engaging in some of those more shock tactics that I know are used when teaching these kind of subjects a little bit more when you're older, at university, for example.
Yeah, definitely. University would talk about cases that are more, yeah, as you said, shocking. With kids, I think one of the wonderful thing about kids, our job throughout the ages, our job as educators, as parents, is to, I think, inspire, right? Put out ideas and see where they catch. So we go around. For example, the other day I was walking with one of my sons. We were walking to music class and we found a dead squirrel, right? It's just on the hill. And it was sad because this was just a beautiful little creature and it was so perfect. And I don't know why it died, right? But it was a moment where we both stood there and we saw this little creature that had died. And we talked about what we should do. Should we pick it? Well, we don't have any, I don't know why it's dead, and I don't think I should pick it if I can't wash my hands. But we moved it gently, and then on their way back, we saw a cat get it and walk away with it, and the cat was looking really proud. Like, I've hunted a squirrel, these are so hard to catch. But that led to so many conversations about life and about how the cat felt and what would happen to the squirrel and how we should respect the life cycle. And it was so organic, right?
Mm.
And it was also done again in the back of my mind. I'm thinking about how to do this in a way that's kind to my son, but also honest to his questions. And I like, even in moments like this, if possible, adding some sort of gentle humor to bring it up. So that's how you do it. You just integrate it in day-to-day life. I bring up topics to my kids. I watching the news, I'm like, have you heard this? What do you think about this? Um, and we just enter into a discussion. We read a lot, and literature is I read a lot. One of my kids, I should say, doesn't like books, so let's not romanticize the whole thing. But he watches videos, and so we might watch a movie together, watch cartoons, and enter into discussions from that, talk about, how different characters behave or the ethics of science if we're looking at a movie with superheroes. So we just engage in this constant conversations. Now, it's kind of unfair because obviously this is my background. So whenever I'm doing this, I'm making connections like, oh, I could bring, Pythagoras here. So obviously I know that this is, if it's not your background, then you're like, what is this crazy lady talking about? So, um, so there are wonderful resources out there, and I'll use this as a way to plug in my book, which you didn't tell me to do, but there you are. At some point there'll be a book which can inspire conversations, but I need to finish like the editing now, which is not fun.
Well, I know that I think possibly the first course or the first class that my son ever did with you, I think came from a friend of ours who lives in Bahrain who did a maths class with
Oh,
you, which
Caroline. Yes,
was
of course.
Caroline did a class which was something like the statistics of Star Wars. Now, my son loves maths and he loves Star Wars, and he was about 9. And I remember thinking, this has his name like written all over it. And Caroline was a friend of ours, and I signed him up. And it was such a wonderful way of bringing in all of the kind of natural passions of children into something, and he learnt so much just from that one hour that he did. And I think that's, you say about how these kind of subjects can be very organic and can just kind of occur on a day-to-day basis and almost in a conversational way. Would you say that there are any I don't know, any times when would you recommend at any point that you kind of incorporate specific lessons? So, like, once a week we're going to talk about, what's happening in the news, or we're going to do a philosopher a month, or would you recommend that kind of approach, or do you really think that it's better to be responsive and organic?
I think it really depends on families. I know some families do things like Tea Tuesday, right? On Tuesday they have tea and they sit around and tea isn't the drink, not as in the meal. Sit around and have conversations about poetry or bring philosophers. I have tried different things, and it varies on where my family is and what my kids want. So at one point we were reading. We've had lots of different books. We might read like a short bio of a philosopher every day, or we were looking at, every morning we sat down and read a little bit of literature and talked about it. So sometimes we've been more structured and that has worked well for us. Sometimes we haven't. So I think kids change so fast. I think one of the stresses as parents is we think, oh, this is working. And we're like, yes, we found the method. And then next week it doesn't work. And you're like, what happened? I had it. And, they change so fast. So one of the challenges of home education is that you're constantly like flexible. You jump this way, you jump that way. They want structure. They need time on their own. Their hormones are all over the place, right? They need to go outside and run because they have so much energy. And next week they're going to a growth spurt and they just need to lay down and like sleep because next week they're going to be like 2 inches taller. And the wonderful thing is that we have that flexibility because in schools, when I've taught, the kids come and even if they're exhausted, they have to be there because there's that structure. So I think we can do as needed. I do think it's important to have a space where you have these conversations or some sort of conversation about ethics and what you think, right? Because this is our job as parents. And it's really important to create spaces where kids feel able to explore their ideas. And they might have ideas that contradict your views. And that's our hardest challenge as parents, saying, oh, that's really interesting. Why? Let me rethink my views. Maybe I'm wrong. Giving your kids that seriousness. I think it's hard when we're adults to take kids seriously sometimes when they come about big topics like, life and death, justice. And you're like, well, you're a child. And that's so damaging because these are really important topics. We have to listen and we have to create those spaces. And we have to let our kids know that they can disagree with us and that they can form their own opinions as long, that our job is to challenge them to make those opinions based on careful thinking, good evidence seeking, right? And not just what's trending on TikTok or something. And it's really important because this is part of how we safeguard our kids into the future for their well-being, to not fall for traps, to not do things that are dangerous. This is the critical thinking that will make them safe. So it's not just about philosophy and the wonder and joy of it. It's about keeping our children safe in a world that's increasingly digital, full of information, and has dangers.
So again, it sounds like it's back to this idea of empowerment and that these subjects empower our children and arm them, into the future. So the next question word I've got is who, and I wasn't sure about this one, and then I thought, well, actually, this I do know what I'm going to ask for this because would you say that there are any leading figures or leading thinkers in either of these sort of subjects or in political philosophy as a subject that would be maybe good starting ones, or maybe ones that you think are really not exactly mandatory but ones that you would definitely go in with at some point?
That is a tricky question. There's so many. I I think you could go either way. I'm thinking about it chronologically. And if your kids are interested in the present, and who's not interested in the present? That would be really strange. But like if your kids are interested in technology or AI, there's new philosophers that are discussing this area. So I would go that way. If you have kids who are interested in history and the classics, you could start all the way back with Plato and Socrates, right? Um, so I think you could approach it from either way. I mean, I don't want to provide a list of because I can't. There's just too many.
You
I'd be
can't
like,
give us like your
just
top 5 favorites, like favorite
well,
children amongst philosophers?
um, I can give you my top 5 favorite philosophers, but then they change week by week. I mean, I love Plato, but he's got issues. But they all have issues. That's the thing. The other thing we have to understand with when we study philosophy, because it's a philosopher center approach, right? We learn these people, and we also have to learn that they're just people and that they might have some good ideas, but they also had a lot of bad ideas. And I think that's empowering because then it means that you could also have really good ideas and bad ideas, right? That it evens the studying ground, right? And sometimes in history, it's been sort of romanticized, like the greats. They were great in some way, they were awful in other ways, right? And I think that's also important because I'm teaching this class on women in philosophy right now. And just looking back at so much of what we teach is all men and all Western men. And that needs to be changed, right? We need to bring in these other voices. If we're going to be looking at philosophy, it can't be all men. It should, we can look at philosophy from other parts of the world, bring everybody in. So there's so much to be done. So yeah, I love Plato. I'm trained in Western political philosophy. That's my background, right? But I'm trying to expand it as much as possible. I like
I,
Hobbes. I like, there's lots of philosophers that I think are really fun to play with our kids, if you know their ideas. For example, with Hobbes, this is always at some point comes up in a class, which is, you know, the Lord of the Flies scenario, which is what he came up with, right? If you put kids out into the wild and take away all the rules, what's going to happen? Will they like start stabbing each other? Will they eat each other? Or will they, collaborate and hold hands? And, what's going to what is human nature? I think that's just such a fun thing to think about. And it links into culture and it links into education, all sorts of things going there. Yeah.
I mean,
But
I know exactly what you mean about philosophy, um, and philosophers with their slightly problematic sort of sides to them. My favorite philosopher is Heidegger, and Heidegger was like a deeply problematic human being, and so much so that it's almost difficult to like his philosophy because he was such a nightmare as a man. But then you look at all of the others, and they're all pretty bad. So in actual fact, then let me ask you: is there a female philosopher and a non-Western philosopher that you would recommend as a just as a kind of route for any of our listeners who want to bring in something that's a little bit less male, a little bit less white?
I just finished a book. So this would be for teens rather than young kids. But I just finished reading Octavia Butler's Kindred. Have you read it?
No.
So she's an African American writer. Of course, it also comes back to how we define philosophers, right? Because philosophers tend to be like, ooh, you have to sit in a university. But writers are philosophers, right? They're exploring ideas, they're presenting, they're contesting truths. So, and one of the things that has been done by naming only some people philosophers is to take away the voice of others. So I think we should expand that. And in that spirit, I've finished reading this book by Octavia Butler, and she explores. It's fun because it has time travel, and I'm fascinated with time travel. But it explores racism and identity and justice as you travel through time. So I think that's a really, and it's literature, so you can get into the study, but the story. But as you read the story, then you can start talking about, well, how would we in the present understand people in the past? And is that a fair assessment? Or, how would we treat them if we went back there, which is kind of what she plays with. Do we need the past to be who we are? Because, there's this element of familial links, and I won't spoil it anymore. So that's one that I really like. Mary Wollstonecraft, of course, if you're going to be looking at female philosophers, she's wonderful. Simone Weil, one of my favorites. She was just fascinating because I like people who put their money where their mouth is, right? So she's like, I want to understand the working person, so I'm going to become a working person. So she went out there and worked in factories. She had really, really thick glasses and made it really hard for her to see. So she was not really suited for this hard physical labor that she wanted to do, but she did it anyways. She was so clumsy, so she stepped in a pot of boiling oil, and she still wanted to keep going. And she would go and work all day, and then she realized that she worked all day, really hard physical labor, and she wanted to come home and then philosophize about it. And she realized she couldn't because she was so tired. And she realized, how can we ask people that work so hard physically to then do extra, right? It's not fair. It's not that they're not thoughtful or thinking, it's that they're so physically exhausted. So she truly understood the injustice of this class system where some people are unable to exit the physical labor because they're just so tired that they can't do anything else. She's wonderful.
I
Yeah,
actually
I'll stop
recorded
because.
I actually recorded a podcast recently with a lady who was home educated herself and now is home educating her children. And she was describing that when she hated school, and she was
Mhm.
describing that when she was at school, it took all her energy just to get through school, such that when she went home and at the weekend, she did literally nothing. She was incapable of doing anything else because it just all her energy just went through just getting through the process of the 9 to 4 kind of school system. And I think what you were saying there about Simone Weil, was it?
Mhm.
Who I think so often there's a privilege to philosophizing, isn't there? That I'm guessing is why it is sort of has become was historically a male domain.
Yeah, but that also brings up a really interesting point what you've mentioned, which is I don't know why this particular lady you mentioned struggled with school, but I it reminds me of neurodiversity, which is also a new thing that I'm exploring with philosophy. And it reminded me of me in school, and I found the same. Like I got through school, I did really well in school, but I was so grumpy. Like, and I realize now that I was just given, I was masking so much and working so hard that by the time I got home, there was nothing left to me. Like I felt like I was just skin and bones, and I just needed to sit there. And then if anybody came close to me, I just scratched, right? And I was just being drained. The system didn't work for me. Um, I'm not an extrovert, right? I need a lot of time on my own, and like hours of sitting with kids screaming next to me just doesn't work. And that's and part of what we do at Thinkers Meetup is look out for neurodiverse kids because the traditional schooling system hasn't worked for them. And I was thinking about this in terms of philosophy because I've been looking at how many philosophers were neurodivergent. And this is part of the reason why they came up with this idea is because they were looking at the world in a different way. And this is part of what home educated kids do. They look at the world in a different way because they're not in the structure. And we need that because that's where the new ideas come from. And so, unless we have an educational system that allows this diversity, including this neurodiversity, right? But also these marginal voices we've talked about in terms of, nationality, language, accents, etc., we won't move philosophy ahead to new ideas. So we need this. And I think it's ironic that the system is set up so that philosophers need to go through this system that weeds out anybody who's different, right? It just doesn't make any sense.
It doesn't, because obviously it's the difference in thinking that creates the philosophy. Okay, so I'm going to combine my last two questions together, which is what and where, because I think actually they're probably asking the same thing, which is, are there any particular resources or YouTube channels or I don't know, books or anything that you would recommend as either starting points for the children or possibly ideas for the parents?
Um, I can come back to you with a full list because I'm not very good at keeping data in my head. That's just not the way my brain works. But off the top of my mind, I really like the crash courses, right? They're just fun as a starting point. Um, I look at a lot of yeah, they're good for philosophy. A lot of the philosophy stuff I look at is older, like more boring. So I'll come back to you with that one because
Yeah.
I'm just not good at listing things.
That's fine. What I'll do then is for anyone listening, I will put the list that Karem gives me on our Facebook group, and then if I'm very clever and can be bothered, I'll put it on our Facebook page as well, so it's easier for people to find. I know that there's a YouTube channel that's called something like In a Nutshell, but it has a really long, complicated word in front of it, like
The German
Kurgus.
one.
Is
Yeah.
it German? I always thought it was maybe like Kazakh or something, but it may well be German. But it's
It
very
was in,
good. I quite liked that one.
it was introduced to me by a German friend. So I just assumed it was German, but honestly I don't speak German. Yeah, I've seen a little bit of it. Again, this friend loves it. My kid quite likes it. I haven't explored it in detail, but a couple of the things I've seen seem fine.
Are there any podcasts that you listen to?
In our time.
Oh, yes. Oh my God, my son and I absolutely adore that one. I feel like we have maxed out every category of
It's
In Our Time. Their
wonderful.
archive is amazing, isn't it?
It's wonderful. And you can get like his interviews with philosophers are printed separately, so you can get the book. And so that's wonderful. There is this is for older people probably. Again, I'll find it. It's called The Vox. That's not a podcast, but it has a list of female philosophers and how to teach them.
Was that the
Um,
Vox, did you say?
I think so, but I'll have to
Mm,
look it up for you.
sure.
And the other one, again, this is a fun podcast, right? Wow in the World, which is really goofy and I love it. But it also like it just gives you nuggets if of ideas to discuss with your kids when it comes to science, when it comes to ethics, when it comes to how do we know things. So I love it. I quite enjoyed listening to it with my kid and then talking about it afterwards.
That was Wowing the World, was it?
Wow. Oh, you don't know it? Yeah.
No, I don't know
I,
this one.
I assume
Wowing the World.
everybody knows
Okay.
this. Yeah, wow in the world.
And for anyone who's listening who didn't catch it, that's In Our Time, which is on the BBC, which is a Melvin Bragg program, a radio program. All right, so I feel like we have covered all of the big questions that I had to ask. Is there anything you want to say before I wind up, Karam, about home education, about philosophy, about politics, about anything? I mean, given your CV, you can talk to me about anything. I'll listen.
No, I guess, because of your audience, I would say, well done. I will say, it's hard to educate in any context, right? And home educated parents are making a choice that's out of the ordinary. It's stressful. We're constantly questioning ourselves. We have to question our own philosophy of education. So I just want to applaud the parents that do it and give them encouragement and say, keep going. It's a wonderful thing to do for your kids. It's wonderful to enter into these conversations. And to you, well done. You're so impressive. All the stuff you have done. I've always just been standing in the backdrop saying, my goodness, how does she do it? So
Oh,
thank you so
that's so
much for what you
sweet.
bring to the home educated community.
Oh, thank you very much. And as you were summing that up so nicely, I decided that I'm going to make this our last episode because I actually, even though I record them at sometimes, I actually put them out depending. I like to like scatter different topics around. So I'm going to make this our last episode because the way you've just summed up home education is just so perfect for me. And I completely agree. I think that home educating is an inherently difficult thing to do. Doing anything different in society is really difficult, and doing something with your children different is even harder because people seem to think it's okay to judge you for parenting in ways they would never judge you for any other life choice, but they seem to think it's okay. It's like a kind of fair play to do that. And so I think it's really difficult, and to go against a schooling system and to go against a societal system like that is constant hard work, and also it's kind of a bit thankless and it can be a bit lonely and it can be difficult, but as you've just said, it has so many wonderful benefits. And for me and for my family, it has been the most amazing journey. Like all the way through, it's been fabulous. And so it's been 15 years of like a wonderful, fabulous roller coaster. And it's been lovely to have a last podcast with you. I mean, there couldn't be anything better. So thank you so much for coming on. And oh, before I finish, of course, do tell our listeners where they can find you on the internet.
Yeah, sure. I am there. I Thinkers Meetup, you can find it at www.thinkersmeetup.com. Yes, and you can also Google me. I've just created a website. It's really embarrassing, but I have it because, yes, I'm going out and I'm trying to spread more information about education and how we can do it to make it more respectful to all that humans are and in a way that changes the world. I have other projects coming up that I would love to have people involved in. I'm just trying to bring kids together from different countries to build these communities of conversation to work towards a world that's more humane. So yes, join me, get in touch. I love to help anybody I can.
What's your personal website then, or what's this new website
My
you set up?
website is just karemroitman.com. I'm not very creative, but my name is odd, so nobody else has it.
I know it's the same with mine, even though mine doesn't sound unusual. I'm the only. I think there's one other Eleanor Marker somewhere in like South America, but yeah. So I'm always able to claim my name as well. So it's all rather
Great.
nice, isn't
So
it?
useful, yeah.
It is useful. And I said to my children who also have unusual names, I said, get straight in there and get your Gmail account.
That's a good point. I will tell them this
Mm.
advice now.
Claim it nice and early. Well, thank you, Karem. It's been
Thank
wonderful having
you.
you on the show today. And it's been a really amazing way to end my podcast. So thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Okay, and then a last message from me, because this is my last podcast, and the podcast has been running now for nearly 2 years, and it's been a difficult decision to wind it up, but I decided that because I was finishing my home education journey, it seemed a good time to finish my home education podcast. And thank you so much, everybody, for being here week after week on my podcasting journey with me. I know that you enjoy it because I get wonderful comments and so many thousands of you listen, which I never imagined when I first started this. So thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to come into your houses every Sunday and to give you another episode on home education. And don't forget that all of our episodes will be available on our YouTube channel forever and eternity, Home Education Matters UK. And all of our episodes are archived there. So if you ever want to listen to an episode again, or if you want to recommend an episode to any of your friends, they'll all be there on our YouTube channel when they finally go off Podbean and off Spotify. They'll all be there on YouTube on Home Education Matters UK. So thank you again. Amazing work, home educating. Home educating is not easy, but it is fabulous. So thank you so much for joining me week after week on my podcast. Thank you so much for joining us for today's Home Education Matters podcast. See you at the next one. Have a lovely day.